The USB drive had been hiding behind 3 years of tax returns in Robert's desk drawer, labeled in his careful handwriting, "Sarah, only if I die." 3 months after my husband's car collided with an oak tree during that terrible storm in March, I was finally sorting through his home office when my fingers brushed against the small device that would shatter everything I thought I knew about the man I'd loved for 25 years. I sat in his leather chair, the one where he'd spent countless evenings grading papers and working on lesson plans for his high school math classes, and stared at the USB drive for nearly 10 minutes before inserting it into his laptop. The screen flickered to life, revealing a single video file dated just 2 weeks before Robert's accident. If you're watching, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what time you're listening. When I clicked play, my husband's face appeared on screen, but he looked nothing like the confident, gentle man I'd shared breakfast with every morning for a quarter century. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face pale and drawn, and his hands shook as he positioned himself in front of the camera. "Sarah," he began, his voice cracking on my name. "If you're watching this, then I'm gone, and it's time you learned the truth about who you've been married to all these years." I felt my chest tighten as Robert, my Robert, the man who helped Alex with homework every night, who brought me coffee in bed every Sunday morning, who held me during thunderstorms because he knew they made me anxious, took a shuddering breath and continued. "My name isn't Robert Mitchell, it's James Patterson. 26 years ago, I ended the lives of Robert Mitchell and his entire family." The words hit me like physical blows. I paused the video, needing to catch my breath, needing to process what I'd just heard. My husband wasn't Robert Mitchell. The man I'd married, the father of my son, had been living under a stolen identity for over 2 decades. I pressed play again, my hands trembling as Robert, "James?" continued his confession. "Sarah, you have to understand how it happened. Robert and I had been best friends since freshman year of college. Everyone said we looked like twin brothers. Same height, same build, same dark hair and brown eyes. People used to joke that we must have been separated at birth." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, and I could see the weight of whatever secret he was about to reveal crushing down on him. The night it happened, I was supposed to be the designated driver. Robert's family, his parents Helen and David, his sister Jessica, they'd invited me to join them for Helen's birthday dinner at that restaurant outside town. Robert had been so excited about me meeting his family properly. You see, he'd grown up in foster care since he was 5, bounced around different homes, never really had a stable family, until the Mitchells took him in during his senior year of high school and officially adopted him. I thought about all the stories Robert had told me about his childhood, about growing up in foster care, about finally finding a family who loved him. Those stories had made me love him even more. This man who'd overcome abandonment and uncertainty to become such a devoted husband and father. We'd all been drinking at dinner except me, because I was driving Robert's car. But Sarah, after we left the restaurant, I made a terrible decision. We stopped at a gas station, and while everyone was inside, I had a flask in my jacket. I thought just a few drinks wouldn't matter. I thought I could handle it. My stomach dropped as I began to understand where this confession was heading. The rain started during the drive home, heavy, blinding rain that made the roads slick and dangerous. I was going too fast, Sarah. I was drunk and going too fast on that winding mountain road, and when I came around the curve near Miller's Creek, I lost control. Robert's voice broke completely, and he sat in silence for nearly 30 seconds before continuing. The car flipped 3 times and landed upside down in the creek. When I came to, I was thrown clear of the vehicle, but Robert and his family, they were all trapped inside. Sarah, they were gone instantly. The impact, the water. I took away 4 lives in a single moment of stupidity and selfishness. I felt nauseous as the magnitude of what he was telling me began to sink in. The man I'd loved, the man I'd built a life with, had been responsible for ending 4 lives and had been living under the identity of one of his victims. When I heard the sirens approaching, I panicked. I knew I was drunk, knew I'd be facing vehicular homicide charges, knew my life was over. And that's when I noticed that Robert and I were wearing almost identical clothes. Dark jeans, similar jackets. In the darkness and chaos, with our faces, Sarah, we looked so much alike that even close friends sometimes confused us. Robert paused the recording again, apparently needing time to gather courage for what came next. I switched places with him, Sarah. I dragged Robert's body to where I'd been thrown from the car and put myself in the driver's seat. When the police and paramedics arrived, I told them that Robert's father David had been driving, that I was Robert Mitchell, and that I'd been thrown clear during the crash. The room seemed to spin around me as I absorbed this confession. My husband had not only caused a fatal accident while drunk, but had then manipulated the scene to avoid responsibility, allowing Robert's father to be blamed posthumously for the tragedy. Because Robert had grown up in foster care and had limited extended family, there was no one to question inconsistencies in my story. I knew enough about his background from our friendship to answer basic questions. The trauma of the accident explained any behavioral changes people noticed. I stared at the screen, watching this man I'd thought I knew completely reveal himself to be someone I'd never known at all. For 26 years, I've lived Robert's life. I finished his teaching degree, got his teaching job, met and married you using his name. Sarah, every day has been both a blessing and a torture, living the life that Robert dreamed of having, raising the family he always wanted, while knowing that I stole it all from him by taking away his chance to live it himself. The video continued for several more minutes, but I could barely process the additional details he shared about forged documents, carefully constructed lies, and the constant fear of discovery that had haunted him for over 2 decades. Hello, please also tell me in the comments what kind of stories you most enjoy watching here on the channel. This helps me bring you the best content. When the recording ended, I sat in stunned silence in my husband's study, surrounded by 25 years of memories that had suddenly become artifacts of an elaborate deception. The man who'd been the center of my world, the father of my son, had been living a lie so comprehensive that our entire life together was built on someone else's stolen identity. The worst part wasn't just the deception, it was realizing that the gentle, loving man I'd known had been capable of such calculated manipulation in the aftermath of a tragedy he'd caused. Some secrets I was discovering weren't just hidden truths about the past. They were revelations that could destroy everything you thought you knew about the person you'd loved most in the world. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw James's face on that video, confessing to a deception so elaborate that it had fooled everyone, including me, for over 2 decades. I wandered through our house in the darkness, looking at family photographs with new eyes, wondering how many of the memories I treasured had been built on lies. The man smiling in our wedding photos wasn't Robert Mitchell. The father teaching Alex to ride a bicycle wasn't the person his birth certificate claimed him to be. The husband who'd held me through my father's funeral last year had been living under the identity of someone whose life he'd accidentally ended on a rainy night 26 years ago. By dawn, I'd made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. I called my office and canceled my morning classes, telling my department secretary that I was dealing with family complications following my husband's death. Then I drove to the public library and spent 3 hours researching newspaper archives from 1998, searching for any coverage of the accident that had changed everything. The Hartford Courier had run a front-page story on March 15, 1998. Local family dies in tragic crash. The article described how David Mitchell, 52, had lost control of his vehicle during heavy rain on Route 127, resulting in the deaths of himself, his wife Helen, 48, daughter Jessica, 19, and adopted son Robert, 24. The lone survivor had been Robert's college friend James Patterson, 24, who'd been thrown clear of the vehicle and suffered only minor injuries. I stared at the newspaper photograph showing the accident scene, the overturned car in Miller's Creek, emergency responders working in the pouring rain, and a young man with a blanket around his shoulders talking to police officers. The young man was labeled as Survivor James Patterson, but I could see now that it was actually Robert Mitchell claiming to be James. The article quoted the survivor. Mr. Mitchell was driving carefully, but the rain made the roads impossible. It happened so fast. One moment we were talking about his daughter's college plans, and the next moment the car was flipping. They were such good people. Robert was like a brother to me. Reading those words, lies that James had told to avoid responsibility, while Robert's father was posthumously blamed for the accident, made me feel physically sick. How had James managed to live with himself, knowing that he'd not only caused the crash, but had also destroyed David Mitchell's reputation by making him appear responsible for his family's destruction? I continued researching, finding follow-up articles about the funeral service for the Mitchell family, and a scholarship fund established in Robert's memory at the high school where he'd planned to teach mathematics. James had not only stolen Robert's identity, he'd also stolen the career and dreams that Robert would never have the chance to pursue. When I returned home, I found Alex in the kitchen making lunch before his afternoon classes. Looking at my 22-year-old son, I felt overwhelmed by the complexity of what I'd learned. Alex had grown up believing Robert Mitchell was his father, taking pride in the Mitchell family name, planning to follow in his father's footsteps by becoming a teacher himself. "Mom, you look terrible. Are you feeling okay?" "I'm just tired, honey. Still processing everything since your dad's accident. I know it's been hard. But Mom, I've been thinking about something Dad always told me about overcoming difficult circumstances and making the most of opportunities life gives you. He said that sometimes people get second chances they don't deserve, and the important thing is what they do with those chances." I felt my throat tighten as I realized Alex was unknowingly describing his father's entire approach to the identity theft that had defined our family's existence. "What made you think about that particular advice?" "I've been looking through Dad's teaching materials and personal papers, trying to put together a memorial presentation for his school." Alex paused, apparently noticing my expression. "Mom, I found some things that seemed a little strange." My heart rate increased dramatically. "What kind of things?" "Letters and documents that don't quite make sense. Like, there are references to childhood memories that don't match the stories Dad told us about growing up in foster care. And I found a high school yearbook from a school Dad said he never attended." I realized that James's carefully constructed identity was beginning to unravel under Alex's investigation, just as it had for me when I'd found the USB drive. "Alex, those inconsistencies might be related to trauma from the accident that happened during his college years. Sometimes people's memories get confused after experiencing something that devastating." That's what I thought initially. But Mom, I also found correspondence with people he claimed not to know, including letters from someone named Patterson family asking about James's whereabouts and well-being. I felt cold as I realized that Alex was independently discovering clues that would eventually lead him to the same devastating truth I was still processing. "Alex, I think you should stop going through your father's personal papers for now. Some things are private, and investigating them might not bring the closure you're hoping to find. But Mom, don't you want to understand who Dad really was? Don't you think we deserve to know the complete truth about his background and experiences?" The irony of Alex's question was almost unbearable. He was asking for exactly the truth I'd discovered, but wasn't sure I could share with him without destroying his understanding of everything he'd believed about his father and our family. "Sometimes, Alex, learning more about people we love reveals complications that are more painful than helpful. Are you saying there are things about Dad that you think I shouldn't know?" I looked at my son, this young man who'd inherited James's intelligence and Robert's gentle nature, who'd grown up believing he was carrying on the Mitchell family legacy, and realized I was facing an impossible decision about how much truth a person could handle about the foundation of their entire identity. "I'm saying that sometimes the people we love have made choices that are difficult to understand, and that learning about those choices requires being prepared for information that might change how we see everything we thought we knew." Alex studied my face with the same analytical intensity that had made him an excellent student, apparently recognizing that I was talking around something significant rather than answering his questions directly. "Mom, are you saying that Dad had secrets that would change how I think about him?" Some conversations, I was learning, forced parents to choose between protecting their children from painful truths and respecting their right to understand the reality of their own lives. I wasn't sure which choice would serve Alex better, but I was certain that the decision I made would affect not just his relationship with his father's memory, but also his understanding of his own identity and our family's place in the world. That evening, after Alex left for his night class, I sat in Robert's study staring at the USB drive that had upended my entire understanding of reality. I needed to watch the video again to catch details I might have missed in my initial shock, but I also dreaded hearing those revelations a second time. This time, I forced myself to pay attention to the background details James had shared about his elaborate deception. He'd explained how he'd spent weeks in the hospital after the accident, using that time to study every detail of Robert's life that he could extract from medical records, personal belongings, and conversations with hospital staff who'd known the Mitchell family. Sarah, the hardest part wasn't learning Robert's biographical details, James continued in the recording. The hardest part was becoming the person Robert had been while carrying the guilt of what I'd done to him and his family. He described how he'd finished Robert's teaching degree by claiming that head trauma from the accident had affected some of his memories, allowing professors to reteach concepts he'd supposedly forgotten. He'd explained personality changes as post-traumatic stress, behavioral differences as maturation following tragedy. I threw myself into being the best teacher I could be, not just to honor Robert's dreams, but because I needed to believe that I could do something worthwhile with the life I'd stolen from him. I paused the video, thinking about the devoted teacher I'd married, the man who'd stayed after school to tutor struggling students, who'd spent his own money on classroom supplies, who'd been beloved by colleagues and students alike. Had that dedication been genuine care for education, or had it been James's attempt to atone for his crimes by living Robert's dreams better than Robert might have lived them himself? The recording continued with details about how James had met me 2 years after the accident, during his first year teaching at Jefferson High School. I remembered that time clearly. I'd been the new English teacher, and Robert had been assigned as my mentor to help me navigate the school's policies and procedures. I fell in love with you immediately, Sarah. Not because I was lonely or because I needed someone to complete my false identity, but because you were everything I'd ever hoped to find in a partner. You made me want to be worthy of the love you offered, even though I knew I never could be. I remembered our courtship, how patient and attentive Robert had been, how he'd seemed almost grateful for every moment we spent together, as if he couldn't quite believe I'd chosen him. I'd attributed that humility to his difficult childhood in foster care, never imagining it might have reflected guilt about building our relationship on lies. When you agreed to marry me, I knew I should tell you the truth. But Sarah, I was terrified that you'd leave, and I was also terrified that revealing my real identity would destroy the stable life I'd built as Robert Mitchell. I convinced myself that my past didn't matter, as long as I could be a good husband to you. The video showed James breaking down completely as he described our wedding day, how he'd stood at the altar using Robert Mitchell's name while promising to love me honestly and faithfully forever. I meant every word of those vows, Sarah, even though I was speaking them under a name that wasn't mine. I loved you with everything James Patterson had to offer, even though I could only give that love to you as Robert Mitchell. When the recording ended, I felt emotionally exhausted by the complexity of trying to separate the genuine love James had shown me from the elaborate deception that had made our entire relationship possible. Had our marriage been real, if it was built on a foundation of identity theft and vehicular homicide? My phone rang, interrupting my spiraling thoughts. Alex's name appeared on the caller ID. Mom, I'm sorry to call so late, but I found something else in Dad's papers that I think you need to see. Alex, we discussed this earlier. I think you should stop going through... Mom, I found letters. Letters from families named Patterson asking about their missing son James, who disappeared after a car accident in 1998. They're dated from 1999 through 2003, all sent to the school where Dad worked, all asking if anyone had information about James Patterson, who they'd lost touch with after he survived that crash. I felt my stomach drop as I realized that James's biological family had spent years searching for him, never knowing that he'd assumed Robert Mitchell's identity and was living a completely different life just a few hours away from their home. Alex, those letters. Mom, there are also medical records in Dad's files that don't match his supposed medical history, blood type documentation that contradicts what his driver's license says, and dental records that appear to have been altered. I realized that Alex's methodical investigation was uncovering the same inconsistencies that would eventually lead him to discover James's true identity, whether I revealed the truth or not. Alex, can you come home tonight? I think we need to have a conversation about what you've been finding in your father's papers. Are you saying you know what these inconsistencies mean? I thought about the USB drive sitting on Robert's desk, containing a full confession that would answer all of Alex's questions while simultaneously destroying his understanding of his father, his family, and his own identity. I'm saying that I've learned some things about your father's background that explain the discrepancies you've been discovering, but that this information is complicated and painful in ways that require careful discussion. Mom, How long have you known about these discrepancies? Alex, just come home. This conversation needs to happen in person, and it needs to happen tonight. After ending the call, I stared at the USB drive and realized I was facing a decision about how to reveal information that would change Alex's life forever. I could show him James's confession video, which would give him complete truth, but might traumatize him with its raw emotional intensity. Or I could try to explain the situation gradually, preparing him for revelations that would challenge everything he'd believed about our family. Either way, my son was about to learn that his father had been living under a stolen identity for over 2 decades, and that our entire family history was built on lies told to avoid responsibility for ending 4 lives in a drunk driving accident. Some secrets I was discovering became impossible to maintain once other people started asking the right questions. And some children deserve to know the truth about their heritage, even when that truth would shatter their understanding of everything they'd been raised to believe about themselves. Alex arrived home within an hour, carrying a manila folder stuffed with documents he'd been collecting during his investigation into his father's background. I watched him spread the papers across our dining room table, letters from the Patterson family, medical records with inconsistencies, and photographs that didn't match the timeline Robert had always given us about his life. Mom, I've been thinking about this all week, and nothing adds up, Alex said, his voice carrying the frustration of someone who'd been trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Dad always told us he grew up in foster care in Hartford County, but these documents suggest connections to families in completely different regions. I looked at the evidence Alex had assembled, realizing that his systematic approach had uncovered many of the same discrepancies that James's confession video had revealed. My son had inherited both his father's analytical mind and his determination to understand complicated problems. Alex, before we discuss what you found, I need to ask you something. How do you think you'd handle learning that everything you believed about your father's identity was fundamentally incorrect? What do you mean by fundamentally incorrect? I mean discovering that the basic facts you've always known about his background, his family, even his name, weren't accurate. Alex studied my face with the same intensity he'd always applied to difficult academic problems. Mom, are you telling me that Dad lied about his identity? I realized there was no way to ease Alex into this revelation gradually. The evidence he'd already collected, combined with the questions he was asking, meant that partial truth would only create more confusion. Alex, yesterday I found something in your father's study that explains all the discrepancies you've been discovering. But this information is going to change your understanding of who your father was and who we are as a family. What did you find? I retrieved the USB drive from Robert's study and connected it to my laptop, positioning the screen so Alex could see it clearly. Your father made this recording 2 weeks before his accident. Alex, what you're about to see is going to be difficult to process. I pressed play and watched Alex's face as James began his confession. My son's expression shifted from curiosity to confusion to horror as he absorbed the revelation that Robert Mitchell wasn't his father's real name, that James Patterson had been living under a stolen identity for over 20 decades. When James described the night of the accident, the drinking, the crash, the decision to switch places with Robert's body, Alex paused the video and stared at me with complete bewilderment. Mom, is Dad saying that he caused a car accident that ended 4 lives and then assumed the identity of one of the victims to avoid prosecution? That's exactly what he's saying, Alex. So everything we've believed about our family history is based on identity theft and vehicular homicide? I nodded, watching Alex struggle to reconcile the loving father he'd known with the man confessing to crimes that had shaped our entire family's existence. Alex, I know this is overwhelming, but there's more to the recording. Your father explains how he built his life as Robert Mitchell and how that deception affected his relationship with us. We continued watching as James described meeting me, falling in love, and struggling with the guilt of building our marriage on lies. Alex listened to his father explain how he'd tried to honor Robert Mitchell's memory by becoming the best teacher possible, how he'd attempted to live the life that Robert would never have the chance to live. Mom, when Dad talks about trying to be worthy of the love you gave him, he sounds genuinely tormented by what he'd done. Your father carried tremendous guilt about his deception, Alex. But he also genuinely loved us and tried to be the best husband and father he could be under the circumstances. But those circumstances included assuming the identity of someone he'd accidentally ended the life of while driving drunk. I felt the weight of that truth settling between us, the understanding that our family's happiness had been built on someone else's tragedy, and that the man we'd loved had been capable of both terrible judgment and elaborate deception. When the recording ended, Alex sat in silence for several minutes, apparently processing information that challenged his fundamental understanding of his own identity. "Mom, what does this mean for us? For me, am I legally Alex Mitchell or am I Alex Patterson? Is our marriage legitimate if you married someone using a false identity?" Those are questions I've been struggling with since I found this recording yesterday, Alex. I think we're going to need legal advice about the implications of your father's identity theft for our family's status. And what about the Patterson family? These letters show they spent years searching for their son who disappeared after surviving that accident. They never knew James was alive and living under Robert's name. I looked at the letters Alex had found, recognizing that James's biological family had grieved for him unnecessarily while he'd been building a new life just hours away from their home. Alex, there's something else we need to consider. James's confession mentions that he prepared documentation about his crimes and set aside resources for the victims' families. I think he was planning to reveal the truth before his accident. So Dad's death might have prevented him from finally taking responsibility for what he'd done 26 years ago? It's possible. Alex, your father's confession gives us the opportunity to complete the process he'd started, to contact the authorities, to reach out to the victims' families, and to ensure that the Patterson family knows what happened to their son. Alex looked overwhelmed by the moral complexity of our situation. Mom, if we reveal Dad's true identity, we'll be exposing him as someone who caused 4 deaths and then spent decades living under stolen identity. But if we don't reveal the truth, we'll be continuing the deception that hurts so many people. I realized that Alex had immediately grasped the ethical dilemma that would define our family's future, the choice between protecting James's memory and our own stability, or honoring the victims and their families by finally revealing the truth about what had happened that night in 1998. Some children, I was learning, inherited not just their parents' love and guidance, but also the moral consequences of their parents' choices. Alex was about to discover that sometimes doing the right thing required exposing painful truths about the people we'd loved most in the world. Neither Alex nor I slept that night. We spent hours in the living room, surrounded by the documents Alex had collected and the weight of James's confession, trying to understand the scope of what we'd learned and what responsibilities it created for us as his family. Mom, I keep thinking about something Dad said in that video, Alex said, as dawn light began filtering through our windows. He mentioned that he'd prepared documentation about his crimes and set aside resources for the victims' families. Do you think he left instructions somewhere about what he wanted us to do with this information? I think we should search his study more thoroughly. If James was planning to confess before he died, he might have prepared materials to help us handle the aftermath. We spent the morning going through every file, drawer, and storage box in Robert's home office, looking for evidence of the confession plans James had mentioned in his recording. What we found was more comprehensive than either of us had expected. Hidden behind a false back in Robert's filing cabinet, Alex discovered a thick envelope labeled "Complete Documentation" for legal authorities and victim families. Inside were detailed maps of the accident scene, photographs James had apparently taken over the years, copies of police reports from 1998, and a comprehensive timeline explaining exactly how he'd switched places with Robert's body and assumed his identity. Mom, this isn't just a confession, Alex said as we reviewed the materials. This is a complete case file that would allow authorities to understand every aspect of what happened that night and how Dad managed to deceive everyone for over 2 decades. I found additional documentation in a sealed envelope marked "Financial Restitution." James had apparently liquidated several investment accounts and established a fund containing nearly $400,000 designated for distribution to the Mitchell and Patterson families, along with detailed letters explaining his crimes and expressing remorse for the pain he'd caused. Alex, your father spent years preparing to take responsibility for what he'd done. This level of documentation suggests he was serious about confessing and making amends. But he never followed through while he was alive. Mom, do you think Dad's accident was really an accident? Or do you think he might have? The question hung in the air between us. I'd been wondering the same thing since watching the confession video. Whether James's death in a car crash during a storm might have been intentional, his way of avoiding the difficult process of revealing his crimes while still leaving us the means to complete his confession. I don't know, Alex, but I think that question is less important than deciding what we're going to do with the information and resources he left us. We spread all of James's documentation across the dining room table, creating a comprehensive picture of his crimes and his plans for taking responsibility. The materials included contact information for the Patterson family, addresses for surviving relatives of the Mitchell family, and detailed instructions for how to approach legal authorities about the case. Mom, if we follow through with Dad's confession plan, our entire family will be exposed as having been built on lies and vehicular homicide. I'll have to change my legal identity. You'll have to deal with questions about what you knew and when you knew it, and Dad's reputation will be completely destroyed. But if we don't follow through, the Patterson family will continue wondering what happened to their son. The Mitchell family will continue believing that David Mitchell caused the accident that ended his family, and will be continuing a deception that's already lasted 26 years. Alex was quiet for several minutes, apparently weighing the personal costs of revelation against the moral obligation to honor the victims and their families. Mom, I need to ask you something difficult. During your marriage to Dad, did you ever suspect that he wasn't who he claimed to be? I thought about the question carefully, reflecting on 25 years of marriage to a man who'd apparently been living under constant fear of discovery. There were moments when your father seemed haunted by something, times when he'd wake up from nightmares he couldn't explain, times when he'd become emotional about news stories involving car accidents. I attributed those reactions to trauma from the accident he'd supposedly survived, but now I wonder if they were manifestations of guilt about what he'd actually done. Did he ever seem like he wanted to tell you something important, but couldn't find the courage? Actually, yes. Especially in the past year, your father had begun several conversations about important things he needed to share with me, but he never followed through. Alex, I think he was struggling with the decision to confess, and his death might have prevented him from finally telling us the truth himself. That afternoon, I called my attorney, Margaret Williams, to discuss the legal implications of the information we'd discovered. I explained the situation carefully, emphasizing that we'd learned about James's crimes through posthumous confession and hadn't been aware of his true identity during his lifetime. Sarah, this is an extraordinary situation, Margaret said after reviewing copies of James's documentation. Your husband's confession provides evidence of vehicular homicide, identity theft, and fraud that spans over 2 decades. The authorities will need to investigate these claims, and there could be legal consequences for your family's status. What kind of consequences? Your marriage might be considered invalid since you married someone using a false identity. Alex's legal identity could be complicated since his birth certificate lists Robert Mitchell as his father. There could also be inheritance issues and questions about any benefits you've received based on James's assumed identity. Margaret, what would you recommend we do? I would recommend full cooperation with authorities, accompanied by legal representation to protect your interests. Sarah, James's documentation suggests genuine remorse and preparation for taking responsibility. Following through with his confession plan demonstrates integrity and respect for the victims. That evening, Alex and I made the decision that would define our family's future. We would honor James's intentions by revealing his true identity to authorities and victim families, accepting whatever consequences that revelation brought for our own lives. Some secrets, we realized, created moral obligations that extended beyond the people who'd originally kept them. And some children inherited not just their parents' love, but also the responsibility for completing the ethical reckonings their parents had begun, but never finished. The first call I made was to the Patterson family, using contact information from the letters Alex had found in James's papers. After 26 years of wondering what had happened to their son, James's parents deserved to know that he'd survived the accident and had been living under an assumed identity just 3 hours from their home. Mrs. Patterson, my name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm calling about your son James, who you lost contact with after a car accident in 1998. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 10 seconds before Eleanor Patterson responded with a voice that carried 2 decades of grief and hope. Did you say James? Our James? Do you know what happened to our boy? Mrs. Patterson, this is going to be very difficult to hear, But James survived that accident and has been alive all these years. However, the circumstances are complicated, and I think we need to meet in person to discuss what I've learned. He's alive? James is alive? I could hear Eleanor crying, and the sound made my chest tighten as I realized I was about to deliver news that would bring both joy and devastating heartbreak to parents who'd spent over 2 decades grieving their lost son. Mrs. Patterson, James passed away 3 months ago in a car accident, but he left behind documentation that explains what happened after he survived the crash in 1998. I have letters he wrote specifically for your family. 2 days later, Alex and I drove to the Patterson family home in Springfield, carrying James's confession materials and the letters he'd prepared for his biological parents. Eleanor and Robert Patterson were both in their 70s now, worn by years of wondering whether their son was alive or dead somewhere in the world. Mrs. Mitchell, for 26 years, we've hoped that James would contact us, that maybe he'd suffered memory loss or was too injured to reach out, Eleanor said as we sat in their modest living room. We never stopped believing he might come home someday. I handed them the letter James had written specifically for them, watching their faces as they read their son's explanation of why he'd disappeared from their lives and assumed Robert Mitchell's identity. He says here that he caused the accident that ended those people's lives, Robert Patterson said, his voice shaking as he absorbed his son's confession. James was driving drunk and lost control of the vehicle. And then he switched places with one of the victims to avoid prosecution, Eleanor added, tears streaming down her face. Our boy spent 26 years living as someone else because he was afraid to face the consequences of what he'd done. Alex, who'd been listening quietly, finally spoke. Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, I want you to know that the man you raised became a good husband and father, even though he was living under another man's identity. He loved his family and devoted his life to teaching and helping young people. But he built that life on lies and identity theft, Robert Patterson said. James took away 4 lives and then stole one of those lives to escape punishment. I realized that the Patterson family was processing the same complex emotions Alex and I had been struggling with. Grief for their lost son mixed with horror at his crimes, relief that he'd been alive mixed with anger about his deception. Mrs. Mitchell, James's letter mentions that he prepared financial restitution for the families he hurt, Eleanor said. He also says that he wanted to confess before he died, but ran out of courage. What do you plan to do with this information? We plan to contact the authorities and the Mitchell family relatives to reveal the complete truth about what happened in 1998. James prepared comprehensive documentation that will allow everyone to understand exactly what occurred that night. Even though revealing the truth will expose your family to legal complications and public scrutiny? Because revealing the truth is what James intended to do, and because the families he hurt deserve to finally understand what really happened to their loved ones. That afternoon, we met with Detective Lisa Rodriguez from the State Police, who specialized in cold cases and had agreed to review James's confession materials. She listened carefully as we explained how we'd discovered the documentation and our decision to bring it to law enforcement attention. Mrs. Mitchell, this confession provides detailed evidence about a vehicular homicide case from 1998, Detective Rodriguez said after reviewing James's materials. The original investigation concluded that David Mitchell had been driving when the accident occurred, but your husband's documentation suggests that conclusion was based on manipulated evidence. What will happen to David Mitchell's reputation now that we know he wasn't responsible for the crash? We'll work with the district attorney's office to officially clear Mr. Mitchell's record and ensure that the family understands the correct circumstances of the accident. This information will also be important for insurance and legal issues that might still be affecting the Mitchell family. And what about my family's legal status? Alex's identity, our marriage validity, inheritance issues. Those matters will need to be addressed through family court and civil proceedings. Mrs. Mitchell, your cooperation in revealing this information demonstrates good faith, but there will still be legal complications to resolve. The detective explained that James's death prevented criminal prosecution, but that our revelation would trigger investigations into the identity theft, insurance fraud, and other crimes that had enabled James to live as Robert Mitchell for over 2 decades. Mrs. Mitchell, why did you decide to come forward with this information rather than keeping your husband's secrets? I thought about the question, looking at Alex and remembering the Patterson family's 26 years of grief and uncertainty. because my husband spent the last years of his life preparing to take responsibility for his crimes, and because the families he hurt deserve to finally know the truth about what happened to their loved ones. Detective Rodriguez, some secrets create moral obligations that extend beyond the people who originally kept them. That evening, as Alex and I drove home from our meetings with the Patterson family and law enforcement, we both understood that we'd set in motion a process that would permanently change our understanding of our family identity and our place in the world. Some choices about truth and accountability couldn't be undone once they were made. But some secrets needed to be revealed, even when that revelation would create consequences that might follow us for the rest of our lives. The next week brought a series of difficult conversations that would reshape multiple families' understanding of events from 26 years ago. Our first meeting was with Catherine Foster, Robert Mitchell's cousin, and the only surviving close relative of the family James had accidentally destroyed that night in 1998. Catherine, now 58, had spent over 2 decades believing that her cousin Robert's adoptive father David had been responsible for the crash that ended 4 lives. She'd carried anger toward David Mitchell that had colored her memories of the entire family. Mrs. Mitchell, I have to admit that learning the truth about what happened that night brings me both relief and rage, Catherine said as we sat in her living room, surrounded by photographs of the Mitchell family. Relief that Uncle David wasn't responsible for destroying his own family, but rage that some stranger manipulated the evidence to make us believe he was. I handed her the letter James had written specifically for Robert's surviving family members, watching her face as she read his explanation of the friendship he'd shared with Robert and the guilt that had haunted him for decades. He says here that he and Robert looked so much alike that people called them twin brothers, Catherine noted, and that Robert had told him about growing up in foster care before David and Helen adopted him during high school. James used that resemblance and Robert's limited family connections to assume his identity, Alex explained. Our father spent years studying every detail of Robert's background to make the deception convincing. Your father, Catherine said with emphasis that made clear how she felt about James's relationship to us, stole Robert's entire future. My cousin was planning to teach mathematics, to help students who struggled with academics the way he'd struggled growing up in foster care. I felt the weight of that truth, that James hadn't just caused Robert's death, but had also appropriated the dreams and aspirations that had motivated Robert's life choices. Mrs. Foster, James tried to honor Robert's teaching ambitions by becoming the kind of educator Robert had planned to be, I said. That doesn't excuse what he did, but he seemed genuinely committed to living the life Robert would have wanted to live. But he lived that life using Robert's name and identity, which means Robert never received credit for the accomplishments that should have been his legacy. Catherine showed us photographs of Robert from college, and I was struck by the resemblance to James that had made the identity switch possible. They could have been actual brothers, same height, build, facial structure, and coloring that would have made them nearly identical to people who didn't know them intimately. Mrs. Mitchell, what's going to happen to the name Robert Mitchell now? Will your son continue using an identity that belongs to my dead cousin? Alex, who'd been quiet during most of our conversation, finally spoke. Mrs. Foster, I've been struggling with that question since we learned the truth. The name Alex Mitchell represents 22 years of my life, but it's built on someone else's stolen identity. And what have you decided? I've decided to legally change my name to Alex Patterson, honoring my father's real identity while acknowledging the truth about our family background. I felt proud of Alex's decision, recognizing that it demonstrated respect for both the Patterson family and Robert Mitchell's memory, even though it would require him to rebuild his legal identity from scratch. Mrs. Foster, James left financial resources specifically designated for Robert's family, I explained, showing her documentation of the restitution fund. It's not compensation for what was taken from your family, but it represents his attempt to acknowledge the harm he caused. Money doesn't bring back 4 lives or restore Robert's reputation, Catherine said, but I appreciate that your husband finally tried to take responsibility for his actions, even if he waited until after his death to do so. Our next meeting was more emotionally complicated. Detective Rodriguez had arranged for us to meet with David and Helen Mitchell's surviving siblings, Robert's adoptive Aunt Martha and Uncle Edward, who had spent 26 years believing that David had been responsible for destroying his own family through reckless driving. For over 2 decades, We've struggled to understand how David could have been so careless with his family's lives, Martha said, tears in her eyes as she processed the new information. We loved David, but we couldn't reconcile the careful, responsible man we knew with someone who would drive dangerously in bad weather. Learning that David wasn't driving that night, that he and his family were victims of someone else's poor judgment, changes everything we've believed about their deaths, Edward added. I watched these elderly relatives absorb the revelation that their brother-in-law's reputation could finally be restored, that the anger and confusion they'd carried for decades had been based on manipulated evidence. Mrs. Mitchell, your husband's confession will allow us to remember David and Helen and Jessica and Robert as victims rather than as people who died because of David's supposed recklessness, Martha said. That's a gift we never expected to receive. But it's a gift that comes at the cost of learning that a complete stranger destroyed our family and then lived the life that Robert would never have the chance to experience, Edward noted. That evening, Alex and I met with our attorney to discuss the legal implications of the revelations we'd been sharing with law enforcement and victim families. Sarah, the district attorney's office, has reviewed James's confession materials and concluded that his death prevents criminal prosecution, but there will still be civil and administrative consequences for your family, Margaret Williams explained. What kind of consequences? Your marriage will need to be legally validated since you married someone using false identity. Alex will need to establish his legal identity as Alex Patterson rather than Alex Mitchell. There may also be issues with Social Security benefits, insurance payments, and other benefits you've received based on James's fraudulent identity. And what about the teaching position James held for over 20 years? The school district will need to determine whether his teaching credentials were valid and whether any pension or benefit payments need to be recovered. This situation will likely create administrative complications that extend far beyond criminal justice issues. As we drove home that night, Alex asked the question that had been weighing on both of us since we'd begun revealing James's secrets. Mom, do you think we made the right decision in exposing Dad's crimes? We could have kept his confession private and continued living the life he'd built for us. I thought about the Patterson family's 26 years of grief, Catherine Foster's anger at David Mitchell, and the relatives who'd spent decades carrying false beliefs about their loved ones' deaths. Alex, I think some truths create moral obligations that extend beyond our personal comfort or convenience. Some families, we were discovering, inherited not just love and guidance from their parents, but also the responsibility for completing ethical reckonings that their parents had begun but never finished. 6 months after we'd begun revealing James's secrets, the legal and administrative consequences of his decades-long deception had created a complex web of proceedings that touched nearly every aspect of our lives. Alex had successfully petitioned the court to legally change his name to Alex Patterson, while I was working through the process of having our marriage retroactively validated despite James's use of a false identity. The school district where James had taught for over 20 years faced their own complicated decisions about how to handle his employment records and pension contributions. Principal David Chen called me to discuss their approach to James's legacy within the educational community. Mrs. Patterson, he said, using my legal name now that our family's true identity had been established, we're struggling with how to address your husband's teaching career given what we've learned about his background. I understand the complexity, Mr. Chen. James was simultaneously an excellent educator and someone living under a stolen identity. Exactly. His student evaluations and peer reviews were consistently outstanding. Parents requested him specifically because of his dedication to struggling students. But legally, Robert Mitchell never taught at our school. James Patterson did, using fraudulent credentials. What have you decided to do about his employment record? We're maintaining documentation of his teaching effectiveness while noting that his employment was based on misrepresented identity. The pension contributions he made will be transferred to a fund for the actual Robert Mitchell's surviving family members per legal requirements. I felt conflicted about this decision, understanding its legal necessity while recognizing that it erased 20 years of genuine dedication to education that James had demonstrated regardless of his identity issues. Mr. Chen, how are you handling questions from students and parents about what they've learned? We've been honest about the situation while emphasizing that the quality of education James provided was real, even though his identity wasn't. Many former students have reached out to express how much his teaching meant to them, which makes this situation even more complex. The media attention surrounding our revelations had been manageable but persistent. Local newspapers had covered the story as a cold case resolution, focusing on the Mitchell family finally receiving justice rather than sensationalizing James's elaborate deception. The headline in the Springfield Journal read, "26-year-old fatal crash case solved through posthumous confession." "Mom, I've been thinking about something," Alex said as we reviewed coverage of the case. "Do you think Dad planned for his confession to become public, or did he expect us to handle it privately? Based on the comprehensive documentation he prepared, I think James intended for the truth to be revealed to authorities and victim families. He seemed to understand that private confession to us wouldn't address the harm he'd caused to others." "And how do you feel about the way the story has been covered in the media?" I thought about the question as I looked at newspaper photos of the accident scene from 1998, images that now carried completely different meaning since we understood what had actually happened that night. I'm grateful that the coverage has focused on justice for the Mitchell family rather than vilifying James. The reporters seem to understand the difference between solving a cold case and exploiting family tragedy for entertainment. That afternoon, I received a phone call that I'd been expecting but still dreading. Eleanor Patterson, James's mother, called to discuss the memorial service they were planning for their son. "Sarah, we've decided to hold a service that acknowledges both James's crimes and his attempts at redemption through the life he built as Robert Mitchell. We'd like you and Alex to participate if you're comfortable doing so." "Mrs. Patterson, I think that would be meaningful for all of us. How are you and Robert processing everything we've learned?" "It's been difficult. We're grieving our son all over again. First for losing him 26 years ago, then for learning about his crimes, and finally for his actual death 3 months ago. But we're also grateful to know that he tried to live a good life despite the terrible choices he made as a young man." "And how do you feel about Alex and me? We represent the family James built using a stolen identity, but we're also the family who revealed his crimes when we could have kept them secret. Sarah, you and Alex chose to honor the victims over protecting your own comfort. That tells us something important about the kind of people James raised you to be, even if he raised you under false circumstances." The memorial service took place on a cloudy Saturday afternoon in Springfield, attended by the Patterson family, surviving Mitchell relatives, Alex and me, and several of James's former teaching colleagues who'd learned about his true identity through our revelations. Catherine Foster spoke about her cousin Robert Mitchell, describing the dreams and aspirations that had been cut short by the accident. Eleanor Patterson spoke about James's childhood and the grief his family had experienced during his 26-year disappearance. Alex spoke about the father who'd raised him, flawed but loving, guilty but genuinely devoted to education and family. "I grew up believing I was Alex Mitchell, son of a man who'd overcome foster care and tragedy to become a dedicated teacher," Alex said during his eulogy. "Now I know I'm Alex Patterson, son of a man who made terrible choices but spent decades trying to honor the life he'd accidentally taken away from someone else. Both versions of my father loved me, taught me important values, and shaped me into the person I am today." I spoke last, addressing the complexity of loving someone whose entire identity had been built on deception and tragedy. James Patterson lived 26 years under Robert Mitchell's name, but he also lived 26 years trying to become worthy of the life he'd stolen. He was haunted by his crimes, but also genuinely committed to being a good husband, father, and teacher. Learning the truth about his background has been devastating, but it's also allowed all of us to finally understand the complete story of what happened in 1998. As we left the memorial service, Martha Mitchell approached Alex and me with an unexpected request. "Mrs. Patterson, my family has discussed something we'd like you to consider. We'd like you and Alex to help us establish an educational scholarship in Robert Mitchell's name, funded partly by the restitution James provided, but also by donations from people who want to honor Robert's memory and support students who, like him, have overcome difficult circumstances." I felt moved by the suggestion, recognizing it as an opportunity to transform James's crimes and guilt into something that would honor Robert Mitchell's actual dreams and aspirations. "Mrs. Mitchell, I think that would be a beautiful way to ensure that Robert's name is associated with the educational opportunities he never had the chance to pursue himself. Some redemption, I was learning, came not through forgetting painful truths, but through transforming them into opportunities to honor the people who'd been harmed and the dreams that had been lost. 1 year after we'd revealed James's confession, the Robert Mitchell Memorial Scholarship had raised over $150,000 and awarded its first scholarships to 3 students who'd overcome foster care backgrounds to pursue teaching careers. Alex had become deeply involved in the scholarship committee, finding purpose in transforming his father's crimes into opportunities for young people who shared Robert's original circumstances and dreams. Mom, meeting these scholarship recipients has helped me understand something important about Dad's story, Alex said as we drove home from the award ceremony. These students remind me of who Robert Mitchell might have become if he'd lived. People who use difficult backgrounds as motivation to help others rather than as excuses for poor choices. And how does that change how you think about your father? It doesn't excuse what Dad did, but it helps me understand why he felt so driven to become an excellent teacher. I think he was trying to honor Robert by living the kind of life Robert had dreamed about, helping students who struggled academically and needed someone who understood their challenges. I thought about Alex's insight as we passed the school where James had taught for over 2 decades. The building now housed a small memorial display about Robert Mitchell, featuring photographs of the real Robert from college and information about the scholarship established in his memory. It was strange seeing Robert's actual face in a place where James had worked under Robert's name for so many years. Alex, I received an interesting phone call yesterday. Detective Rodriguez said that James's confession has helped solve 2 other cold cases involving identity fraud. Apparently, his documentation techniques were so detailed that they've provided law enforcement with new approaches to investigating similar crimes. Really? Dad's confession is helping solve other cases? James documented every aspect of how he'd assumed Robert's identity. The forged documents, the manipulated medical records, the strategies he'd used to avoid detection. That information has become a resource for investigators working on cases where people have disappeared and might be living under assumed identities. We spent the evening reviewing letters we'd received from families whose missing person cases had been advanced through investigative techniques learned from James's confession materials. Parents who'd been searching for children, spouses who'd been abandoned, and law enforcement agencies working on unsolved disappearances had all benefited from understanding how thoroughly someone could reinvent their identity in 1998. Mom, it's strange to think that Dad's crimes are indirectly helping reunite other families and solve other mysteries. James was methodical about everything he did, including his deception. That same attention to detail that helped him avoid detection for 26 years has now become a tool for helping other victims find answers about their missing family members. 2 days later, I received a phone call that brought our family's story full circle in an unexpected way. Catherine Foster called to tell me that the Mitchell family had decided to donate Robert's original belongings, items that had been stored in David and Helen's attic since 1998, to the Scholarship Fund for display and fundraising purposes. Mrs. Patterson, we found Robert's teaching materials, his college textbooks, and letters he'd written about his plans for helping students who struggled with mathematics, Catherine explained. We think these items should be used to support the scholarship rather than sitting in storage for another 26 years. That sounds like a meaningful way to honor Robert's memory and support the educational opportunities he never had the chance to pursue. There's something else, Sarah. Among Robert's belongings, we found correspondence between Robert and James from their college years, letters that show how close their friendship was and how much they genuinely cared about each other. What did the letters reveal? They reveal that James had been struggling with alcohol problems during college and that Robert had been trying to help him address those issues. Robert had even convinced James to attend counseling sessions and had been serving as his accountability partner for staying sober. I felt a complex mix of emotions learning that Robert had been trying to help James overcome the drinking problems that would ultimately lead to the accident that ended Robert's life. Catherine, that information adds another layer of tragedy to what happened that night. Robert was killed by the very problem he'd been trying to help James resolve. But it also shows that James's guilt wasn't just about causing the accident and assuming Robert's identity. He was also carrying guilt about failing someone who'd been genuinely trying to help him become a better person. The letters Catherine found provided new insight into James's psychological state during the years following the accident. He'd mentioned in several writings found among Robert's belongings that he felt obligated to live the kind of life Robert would have been proud of, as if succeeding as a teacher and family man could somehow justify the terrible choices he'd made that night in 1998. "Mom, reading these letters makes me understand Dad's confession video differently," Alex said, after Catherine shared copies of the correspondence with us. "When Dad talked about trying to be worthy of the love you gave him, I think he was also trying to be worthy of the friendship Robert had offered him. And when he talked about honoring Robert's dreams by becoming the best teacher possible, he was probably thinking about specific conversations they'd had about helping struggling students." That weekend, Alex and I attended the dedication ceremony for the Robert Mitchell Memorial Classroom at Jefferson High School, the room where James had taught mathematics for over 20 years. The space had been renovated with funds from the scholarship program and now featured displays about Robert's actual life and educational philosophy, alongside information about supporting students who faced academic and personal challenges. "It feels strange being here," Alex admitted as we stood in the classroom where James had spent so much of his career. "This room represents both Dad's crimes and his genuine commitment to education." "Maybe that's appropriate," I replied. "James's story is complicated because people are complicated. He was capable of terrible judgment and elaborate deception, but he was also capable of dedication and love." As the ceremony concluded, several of James's former students approached us to share how much his teaching had meant to them. They spoke about his patience with struggling learners, his after-school tutoring sessions, and his ability to make mathematics accessible to students who'd given up on their academic abilities. "Mrs. Patterson, we know that Mr. Mitchell wasn't really Mr. Mitchell," one former student said. "But whoever he was, he changed our lives by believing in us when we didn't believe in ourselves. He taught us that making mistakes doesn't define you. How you respond to those mistakes does," another student added. Listening to these testimonials, I realized that James's legacy was more complex than simple categories of good or evil could capture. He'd committed serious crimes and lived under a stolen identity for decades, but he'd also genuinely helped hundreds of students and tried to honor the man whose life he'd accidentally ended. Some people, I was learning, contained both devastating failures and meaningful redemption, and understanding their complete story required accepting that complexity rather than demanding simple moral categories. James Patterson had ended 4 lives and stolen an identity, but he'd also spent 26 years trying to live worthy of the forgiveness he'd never asked for and the friendship he'd betrayed. 3 years after finding James's confession, Alex graduated from college with a degree in education and announced his intention to become a mathematics teacher, following in the footsteps of both the father who'd raised him and the man whose identity his father had assumed. The irony wasn't lost on either of us that Alex Patterson would be pursuing the same career path that Robert Mitchell had dreamed of before his life was cut short. "Mom, I know it might seem strange that I want to teach math after everything we've learned about Dad's background," Alex said, as we discussed his career plans. "But I think I understand now why Dad was so passionate about education and why Robert Mitchell had chosen teaching as his calling. What do you understand about their motivation?" Both of them had experienced feeling lost or disconnected, Robert through foster care, Dad through his family problems and alcohol issues. They both saw teaching as a way to help other people who felt lost or struggling academically. "And you feel called to continue that work?" "I feel called to honor both of them by becoming the kind of teacher who helps students overcome challenges and discover their potential." Alex paused, apparently considering how to express something important. "Mom, I want to teach at Jefferson High School, in the same classroom where Dad worked for 20 years. I felt moved by Alex's decision, understanding it as both tribute and redemption, honoring James's dedication to education while also honoring Robert Mitchell's original dream of helping struggling students succeed. "Alex, how do you think you'll handle working in a space where your father lived under a stolen identity for so many years?" "I think I'll handle it by being completely honest about who I am and why I'm there. I want students to know that I'm Alex Patterson, son of James Patterson who taught there as Robert Mitchell, and that I'm committed to the same educational values Dad demonstrated regardless of the complications in his personal history." That summer, Alex was hired at Jefferson High School to teach in the Robert Mitchell Memorial Classroom, making him the first teacher to work in that space since the truth about James's identity had been revealed. The principal, Ms. Rodriguez, had specifically supported Alex's application because of his unique understanding of the classroom's complex legacy. Alex brings a perspective that no other candidate could offer, she explained to the school board during his hiring process. He understands both the dedication to education that characterized his father's teaching and the importance of honesty and accountability in addressing past mistakes. On the first day of the new school year, I attended Alex's inaugural class as he introduced himself to 32 freshman algebra students who had no idea about the dramatic history connected to their classroom. "My name is Alex Patterson, and I'm excited to be your math teacher this year," Alex began, standing in the same spot where James had taught hundreds of students over 2 decades. "This classroom has a special history that I want you to understand because it's going to influence how we approach learning and mistakes throughout this school year." Alex explained about Robert Mitchell, the young man who'd planned to teach mathematics to help students who struggled academically, whose dreams had been cut short by a tragic accident. He talked about the scholarship program that supported students pursuing education degrees and about the importance of learning from both successes and failures. "In this classroom, we're going to celebrate the idea that making mistakes is part of learning, and that how we respond to our mistakes matters more than the mistakes themselves," Alex continued. "We're going to support each other through difficult concepts, and remember that everyone deserves help when they're struggling to understand something new." I watched Alex begin his teaching career with the same patient enthusiasm that had characterized James's approach to education, but with an honesty about his family background that James had never been able to demonstrate. Students responded to Alex's authenticity and his genuine commitment to helping them succeed regardless of their academic starting points. That evening, Alex called to share how his first day had gone and to tell me about a conversation he'd had with Catherine Foster, who'd stopped by the school to see how the memorial classroom was being used. "Mrs. Foster told me something interesting about Robert that we'd never heard before," Alex said. Apparently, Robert had specifically wanted to teach at schools that served students from challenging backgrounds because he understood how important it was for struggling kids to have teachers who believed in their potential. "That fits with everything else we've learned about Robert's character and motivations. But Mom, Mrs. Foster also said that she thinks Robert would have approved of Dad teaching in his place, and that she thinks Robert would approve of me teaching there now." "What made her say that?" "She said that Robert believed people deserved second chances and opportunities to make amends for their mistakes. Mrs. Foster thinks Robert would have understood Dad's commitment to honoring his memory through excellent teaching, even if he couldn't approve of the circumstances that led to Dad assuming his identity." 6 months later, I received the final legal documentation that officially resolved the administrative complications created by James's decades-long identity theft. Our marriage had been validated retroactively. Alex's identity as Alex Patterson had been fully established, and all pension and benefit issues related to James's teaching career had been settled through agreements with victim families. Detective Rodriguez called to inform me that James's confession had ultimately contributed to solving 12 missing person cases and had helped law enforcement develop new protocols for investigating suspected identity fraud. "Mrs. Patterson, your husband's documentation has become a training resource for investigators working on identity theft cases nationwide," she explained. "The thoroughness of his records and his honest assessment of how he avoided detection have helped us understand vulnerabilities in identification systems that have since been strengthened." As I hung up the phone, I realized that James's story had evolved from personal tragedy into something that served broader purposes, honoring Robert Mitchell's memory, reuniting other families with missing relatives, and teaching new generations of students through Alex's commitment to education. My husband left me a USB drive confessing that he'd lived 26 years under the stolen identity of a man whose life he'd accidentally ended while driving drunk. But he also left me the opportunity to discover that some secrets, when finally revealed with courage and honesty, can be transformed into justice for victims, reunion for families, and hope for young people who need to believe that mistakes don't define you. What you do after making them does. Some confessions, I had learned, weren't just about admitting guilt. They were about creating opportunities for truth, healing, and redemption that extended far beyond the person who'd originally kept the secrets. James Patterson had spent 26 years living as Robert Mitchell. But his final act of honesty had allowed both men's legacies to finally serve the educational dreams they'd both believed in. The truth had been devastating to learn, but it had also set multiple families free to move forward with honesty, understanding, and hope for futures built on authentic foundations rather than elaborate deceptions. Thank you for listening. Please write a comment rating my story from 0 to 10, subscribe, and send it to someone who also likes to hear stories like this. Best regards.